Lana, thank you for coming in and sharing your deep insights. You got a great background. I mean, you've been recognized by different entities out there for your amazing contributions. And you being, you got an entrepreneurial background as well, which kind of fits my audience because a lot of my audience are entrepreneurs and CEOs and things like that. So thank you for coming in and sharing the insights with my group.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Lana, you have an amazing career and it's continuing. They're definitely impactful. You're definitely in translational work. In other words, taking research and embedding into solutions that can scale globally, and you're really, really successful. There must be inflection points in your life. And it could have been something when you were 3 or 5 or 10, inside the family, outside the family, in school, outside school, maybe some job, career moments. Maybe you could identify 2 or 3 inflection points that shape this wonderful life you have right now.
That's such a great question, Stephen. Really appreciate it. So I love these interviews because it kind of helps me to right reflect, really kind of looking back. So I actually came from a family of physicians. So my parents have passed away since, but growing up, like they always wanted me to become a physician, just like them. Right. So the thesis is always being, oh, you can take care of yourself. So the plus, it's kind of what I grew up with, right? Hospitals and physicians and then really I think the first inflection point for me was really high school where I had this really fantastic biology teacher. I think almost everyone has that kind of teacher that really kind of influenced their life moving forward. So I really very, very much fascinated with genetics, right? Mendelian genetics is very kind of really kind of appeals to the logic side of me. So that really kind of fascinating to me. So I was like, okay, I want to become a scientist, become a biologist rather than become a physician, right? And then kind of being the sort of the bashful self was like, I wanted to get into kind of life sciences, right? If you think about healthcare, you have the payers, providers, physicians, and life sciences companies. So it's very much kind of on the innovation side, right? I want to get into developing new medicine so I can benefit many, many people, right? I can kind of impact at scale rather than treating physicians one at a time. I mean, the sort of the physician patient interaction is a huge and an essential part of healthcare. But I wanted to get into the other side. So that kind of influenced my path forward. So I ended up rather than going to med school, I went to graduate school, and then basically did my postdoc, and then went into industry. So I think my second inflection point, I think I might have like a 4 rather than 3. Second inflection point is really kind of moving the R side in industry to the D side. And the first company I was at went public, and they needed someone who kind of who's a scientist but also has people skills to really build this applications laboratory to turn this research platform at the time was basically DNA chip based platform that will allow you to do a massive amount of like a multiplexing to do either infectious disease diagnosis and STR forensic analysis, or even developing parallel processing for some of the genomics for pharma, pharmacogenomics work. So that was really rewarding interacting with potential customers and then building collaborations. Turns out all the stuff we developed, the applications lab, became commercial product. That was a while back at a company called Nanogen. And then moved to a kind of hospital-acquired infection company called Genome Sciences. And that was acquired by Becton Dickinson. So that was kind of my career. Looking back, I have been very, very lucky in terms of being an entrepreneur, right? Having successful exits and then from a larger entity, building new businesses. So the third inflection point is really kind of I was hired by a oncology company called Genoptics. So they were a oncology reference laboratory providing really highly complex bone marrow kind of diagnosis for hematologic malignancies, right? Leukemias, lymphomas. And then they were like, oh, all this capability can be applied to pharma companies as well. Can you build this business? So that was like really exciting. We built it from zero to $45 million in like less than 5 years. And then the entire company was acquired by Novartis. So that's kind of the really how my foray into global pharma, right? And then the data become a huge problem because the trials we were involved in went from like 30 to 300, right? So as a subject matter expert, I had to manually curate all of this data. So really, at Novartis, and I started to kind of think, can we kind of automate this process using AI, right? Natural language processing at the time. We didn't have large language models yet. So left to co-found Huma AI in 2018, really trying to solve this. Can we automate the data curation, right? Because 80% of the healthcare life sciences data is unstructured and they're trapped in different data silos. So it's really the industry relies on experts like myself to manually curate that data. That's labor intensive, that's time consuming, and more importantly, it actually leaves many mission critical questions unanswered. So, and of course, the last inflection is, we started the company using transformers like BERT, right? So, and then of course, we started collaborating with OpenAI, testing out their Da Vinci models, incorporating them into our platform, really kind of fully embracing generative since 2022. So that has been, I think, the last inflection point for us, or for me personally.
That's a remarkable story arc. And let's kind of go back a little bit. And you're raised in a family of physicians. So that would put a particular kind of pressure on you, I think, right?
Yeah,
In terms of
definitely.
it's
Yeah,
not like, you know what, we want you to go and become an artist. It's probably like, gee, it'd be great if you kind of went into the sciences, I imagine, because it's so science focused, and physicians as well. And physicians are definitely in translational work. In other words, taking any kind of research that's breaking and then applying it in population health and on a consumer kind of basis, and then, scaling it in some way. And it's very practical. So it has a kind of like an engineering feel
yeah,
to it. So I could see how that guided you. And then you talked about this biology teacher, this kind of mentor that kind of instilled in you this sort of love as well. And then you end up finally with a PhD from Indiana University, and you did postdoc at UCSD. So just a really great academic history. But like you said, you liked working with people and things like that. So
yeah,
you end up working with different companies, and I thought this Genoptics background, I thought that was really interesting because you're really taking a biopharma unit from 0 to 45 million in 5 years, and then leading to an acquisition by Novartis. I mean, so you really understand the kind of trials and tribulations of being an entrepreneur in a sense, right?
yeah. That was actually a great fun ride. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's not a 9 to 5 job. It's not a 30-hour week, right? It's sometimes you just got to do what you have to do, and so that's a fascinating background, and how you're always curating data, having to kind of do analysis of data, and you're thinking to yourself, there's got to be a way that we could automate this in some way. And then that led to your journey with Humana AI, right? A CEO, co-founder. So I think that's a remarkable background. And in that mentorship, going back with your biology teacher, what was it? Just sort of the interaction, or the questions that teacher would ask you, or did the teacher incentivize you with sort of projects that would challenge you? How did that mentorship occur?
oh, the teacher was just really, really brilliant, and he was actually very shy. I was like, to give you an example, I ran into him at on campus. He actually saw me and he took a different route to avoid talking to me. I think it was the science that really spoke to me, particularly Mendelian genetics, right? You mean you can actually predict whether the peas are going to be, I don't know how much you know about genetics, right? You can predict like the peas is going to be wrinkled or smooth, or the wings, or, right? So basically, that really kind of, it was so fascinating to me. Basically being able to kind of predict what is going to be. It's almost like, it's almost like pre-computer, right? It's that logic really appeals to me. Yeah.
I see. So you had a really quite shy teacher, but the teacher had a very expansive mind and mindset. So that really kind of an entire sort of a polymath sort of approach, and that was really stimulated you and your curiosity. So I could see that. But it's interesting because you're very effusive. Like, yeah, you definitely have the human touch side and not just the pure sort of analytical side. So you're a rare combination actually to have the two. And I can tell that you enjoy the interaction of
very
part.
much.
You decided to go into industry and you're intrigued by that work in industry. Were there some defining moments specifically or lessons that you could pass to the audience when you entered industry? What are the things that you thought worked, or what are the things that didn't work in this sort of early part of your career arc?
I think the reason, just kind of looking back, right? The reason I chose industry versus academia, I think the first reason was just like I felt like academia was too rigid, right? You have one pass and one pass only, right? It's basically it's very you go, you do your postdoc, you publish, and then you kind of apply for position, and you go to like assistant professor, associate professor, tenure, and this stuff. And like you said, right, I really kind of long for that human interaction. So I just feel like going into industry, would give me more opportunities working with different people, working with large team. And also you probably can tell, like, I'm not the most patient person. So being able to, doing your research for like, working on the same thing for 5 years, I did tough it out through PhD, but it's less appealing to me than doing something, interesting all the time, right? So I think that's some people could see that as a drawback in industry, but I see that as advantage, being able to work on different things.
Yeah, so your ability to innovate in a practical way, and the fact that you have to be pretty agile at industry, right? Because you are measured. You'll know if something works or it doesn't, and you have to look at that feedback and take it and not take it personally, but say, hey, I got to make an adjustment, and you got to do it almost in real time. So you enjoy that kind of activity aspect of it, and then the human interaction. On the genetic side, that side has just really exploded over the last 25 years, right? And in terms of mapping the human genome, and then this whole idea,
Amazing.
AlphaFold X, where
Synthetic biology, just everything, right? It just, yeah. Now, DNA computing, it's just so much going on. Very exciting.
I mean, so I'm going to go a little bit to the side a bit before I go back to what you're doing with Humana AI. And just on this DNA side, there's DNA methylation. There's I thought Yamanaka and these four Yamanaka factors, and how you can take stem cell or adult cells and sort of regress them into pluripotent stem cells. What do you think about that work and the whole side of longevity? There's work at various startups and also at Harvard and different institutions about how that kind of Yamanaka aspect, where you got the Nobel Prize in 2025, by taking some of those root elements and applying it into, kind of youth extension or regeneration and rejuvenation, I guess. I could say maybe at the organ level, but maybe even whole animals, and maybe the potential for humans at some point. What are your viewpoints of that area of work? And then I'd like to go into a little bit of CRISPR, because CRISPR has evolved over the last 10 years, let's say. And then we'll get to some of the work you're doing. So because the genetic aspect has always been an interest of yours. So what are you feeling about some of the things I talked about?
So, disclaimer: I'm not an expert in those areas, right? So it's going to be my opinion as Lana Feng. So, DNA methylation is interesting, right? Epigenetics. I actually did some work there. I think it holds like huge potential because it's so dynamic, right? It influences. It's almost like if you exercise, you see changing methylation, right? And then I think it's harder to capture, harder to analyze than for example like genetic mutations. But I think it's really has huge potential. in terms of sort of applying those in longevity, I mean, we've been studying longevity, right? Regenerative medicine for the longest time, because I remember at Genoptics, our CEO was on the California Regenerative Medicine Coalition, right? A commission, actually. So there's a lot of research has gone into this, and I think really what was before is that the tools were limited. I think now with AI, with advances in system biology, synthetic biology, and we talked about AlphaFold, AlphaFold 3, right? The beauty of AlphaFold 3 is really understanding those molecular interactions, looking at biology from a systematic perspective, from a system perspective. I think this is where we could finalize, realize some of those.
Yeah, I mean, the AlphaFold 3, which was recently released, is really understanding not just the amino acid to protein folding, but as you mentioned, the molecular interaction with proteins, but also with RNA and DNA,
Yeah.
which is a new frontier to be to understand those kinds of interactions, because then that opens up a lot of abilities, even from the therapeutic side, but the diagnostic side, and sort of it's unlimited, right? Yeah.
Yeah, truly looking at biology as a system, right? If you look at a cell, there's like, DNA, RNA, proteins, organelles, and all these different things together, membranes and what have you. So that needs to kind of look at in totality.
Yeah, and then understanding in a way that you couldn't before. It just wasn't really feasible in a reasonable amount of time, right? Okay, I, I'd just like to get your view on CRISPR, because it's gone through multiple editions, and there's now actual use cases of being used, and even on humans, right?
We have the first FDA approval for CRISPR therapeutics.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm actually on the leadership board of an institute called the Terasek Institute for Biomedical Innovations out of Southern California, and their CEO just recently got ranked in the top 10, I think, by Stanford, something like that. And he's kind of like a protege at Bob Langer, and Bob Langer is like a legend.
Yeah.
And I'm just fascinated with that work that's occurring in biomedical innovation, especially on the nano side, and really getting down to biomarkers and being able to sense these things. Do you have any kind of feel about the overall area of biomedical innovation and just where it's going, and where do you think it's going?
I mean, CRISPR is a very exciting frontier, right? That's why gene therapy, CRISPR, all these things kind of lumped together is like a lot of companies now embracing that, starting a new program. I think it's definitely a very exciting area, that a new frontier for biotech, for new medicines. Another area, of course, are the sort of the cell therapies, right? I mean, we see amazing success there. Keytrudas, Opdivos, and all the second generation new drugs and what have you. Like, they reported amazing results for infancy from AstraZeneca at ASCO last week, or actually this week. So not last week. So just lots really exciting stuff going on, right? For CAR T, for example, that was the first FDA approved, came out of Novartis. It's really, the question is just about looking at, bringing a new medicine to market. It's the whole process, right? So, the challenge had been for CAR T, for example, was manufacturing. How do you scale that, right? That's a challenge for the entire cell therapy industry. I think that's going to be something we have to consider for these new interventions.
Yeah, I mean, Shilin Shen is doing some really interesting work. I mean, we could just do a whole sort of discussion on all of that biomedical innovation that's occurring.
Yeah.
Let's focus on Humana AI. Now, you indicated that you were working with OpenAI on the early editions of their large foundation models, even in 2022. So this is pre November 2022 when ChatGPT came out, and became aware of it, right? So
yeah.
You're an early user of that tech. Can you go into more detail then in how you're using that platform for automating data curation, And as you mentioned, high accuracy and transparency. Are you taking advantage of something even prior to retrieval augmented generation? Are you getting even earlier into the fine tuning side of those models, or are you going post, where the available models? Like, where are you in that life cycle of these models when they come out? And as you know, Omni just came out, or
Yep, of course.
oh,
GPT-4, yeah.
yeah. So I'm curious about you made this decision with Humana AI, and then how do you leverage that tech? And can you go into any detail, or maybe it's proprietary?
No, I can go into like high level stuff. So we are called Huma AI. Is humans plus machines, where humans always come first, right? So think about it. When we were using transformers, like earlier transformers, like BERT and BioBERT, was very much that kind of expert in the loop, right? Because we're in this healthcare life sciences, it's a highly regulated industry, it's highly complex industry, and also, it involves saving patient lives, right? So we are actually, I'm going to discuss kind of the RAG first, because that kind of chronologically. So we were actually using RAG since day one, right? Because using NLP to really sophisticated NLP pipeline to actually analyze those sort of relevant insights, right? So we're in the evidence generation business, as you know. Life sciences companies really rely on the evidence generated to do everything, right? So the challenge is that those evidence have to be generated by hand, so it doesn't scale. It takes a lot of time. So we were really kind of the existing at the time, 2022, early 2022. The tools were saw considerable limitations to kind of take the tools to push beyond RAG. So we started to kind of build our own models and seeing whether we can pull some of the large ontology data set to help build a transformer, a large a model. And that just was not seeing really great results, right? Incremental tweaks, as you know. And then we got introduced to OpenAI, and this was 2022, right? So they were focusing on research and also focusing on kind of putting a chat interface on their models. And so they were like, you guys can try all our models, be a beta alpha tester. So we saw how much better they were than ours. We're like, that's a pivot. Basically saying we're going to embrace these large language models. And of course, it's just rapid step of functions, getting, Da Vinci, 3 was better than 2. 3.5 is considerably better than 3, right? 4 is like so much better than we're talking about multimodal. So that's really kind of our journey of getting into the LLM. And then the kind of reflecting our expert in the loop approach. And then we understand life sciences. We understand the complexity. We understand the requirements for responsible AI. So our philosophy has always been experts need to be in the center of this. And secondly, it's not as simple as just inputting data into LLMs.
Right.
So therefore, we kind of build on top of the existing our NLP platform, like put in this LLM, and then on top of this, an expert. So it's very much kind of analysis pipeline. So we approach this as very much a systematic approach that allowed us to achieve like the 97, 98% accuracy as shown by our independent validation with our clients. And then lastly, give you a timeline. We actually deployed this generative AI platform for medical affairs with multiple global pharma clients in Q4 of 2022. So post-validation as OpenAI launched ChatGPT. So it was really interesting. Our champion were like, oh, I just saw this ChatGPT. I was like asking questions. I was like, it's not as great because it's a general model, right?
Right.
It doesn't like deal with like really deep life sciences knowledge that well. So that's where we come in.
That's really, really fascinating because you recognize the ability of these large foundation models to work in the healthcare area. Do you talk to Peter Lee at all, the president of R&D of Microsoft? Because he's been a bit out there on the healthcare side, right? And
Yeah.
publishing a book that there's great this amalgamation. So always having the expert in the loop, as you indicated. But there's a lot of positive capabilities if you merge, if you augment people with or experts with this models. Do you work with Peter at all, or?
Peter is like a great advocate, right? He's an
Yeah,
evangelist and he's out
yeah.
there. I met him a couple of times, but our we have a pretty strong partnership with Microsoft. So we are a Pegasus partner for them. You know that they pick like what 200 startups from their startup ecosystem, what 20, 30,000, and then across all verticals. So I think healthcare life sciences, there's about probably 20 of us, maybe a little more. They continue to add new startups. So that's an invite only program. So we've been working with Microsoft quite extensively.
That's really interesting. I mean, Microsoft has something called Microsoft for Startups, and embedded within that is the Microsoft Startup Funder sub. Anybody can apply. There are some entry requirements. There's some pre-vetting by Microsoft, and then on the back end, and I'm on the back end, so I'm an advisor, mentor, and I get a lot of inbound from those who apply and make it through Microsoft's initial application process. And they provide 350,000 worth of business kind of capability, and within that it's about 150,000 of Azure credits. It's interesting that but you don't see it. It's not visible. And you just talked about the Pegasus program where you got these tens of thousands of startups, and then just a small fraction, like 1%, gets selected to be in the Pegasus program. And that's kind of like, in my view, kind of a layman's view, it's their unicorn builder. It's
Yeah,
where they see
that's really it. Yeah.
it's where they see, what, there's so much potential in global scaling. Are you able to talk about some of the benefits within that program, or is maybe it's secret, right?
I think, I think it's a process. Yeah, so be patient. You have to kind of work through the process because Microsoft is a large company, right? So I'm happy. Some of the work was quite cumbersome because for a startup you want to move 100 miles an hour, right? But then you have to really deal with the minutiae and details going through their process. But I think once you go through it, it's worth it, right? For us, just because we use LLMs very extensively, right? Those credits are actually quite beneficial to us.
Yeah, and as you indicated, you're an early user of retrieval augmented generation. So just for the benefit of audience, like my audiences are not just professors and experts in technology. There are also a lot of CEOs and people like they've left the tech side in a detailed way. Can you explain what RAG is in some detail so that the audience understands how you're able to tailor these models so that it is within the framework of healthcare and what you're trying to do in this Gen AI powered evidence platform, where you're doing integration?
All right. So these large language models like ChatGPT, right? Or GPT-4 model, I should say. It's a model behind ChatGPT. We're now 4.0. They are general models, like I said. They've been trained on, like, for example, 170 billion parameters, pulling all data from the public domain, right? So they can answer questions based on the trainings that's already done, right? For healthcare life sciences, what we use it for is like, okay, take these LLMs like GPT-4 and say, give me the insights on the data I give you. Okay. So don't use your like existing, like you already know, but look at the data I give you, right? Could be scientific publications and what have you. Could be your internal data, and give me the insights. I think this is where you're going to run into limitations, for example, token limit, right? And then complexity of your data and the formats of your data is going to limit like how much data you can put into this. So RAG, retrieval augmented generation, think of it as a very much a pre-processing, if you will, quote unquote. It take your massive amount of data and then basically filter it down to smaller amount and also more enriched for the signal you care about, and then feed that into the element. That's how you increase accuracy. That's how you deal with the complex data problem. That's how you deal with the limit on the size of the data set.
Yeah, so what you're saying, and you use the word signal, so sometimes people may not understand by signal, but like what you're doing is really making this thing more expert or being more of an expert in it.
Relevant insights.
Yeah,
Yeah.
adding relevant insights so that it further educates the system and to understand
Yes.
the healthcare terms and being able
Yes.
to provide much better output that is healthcare related, right? It's like additional training you can give it, but before you get into the prompt kind of stage, I think it's quite remarkable, and papers have come out extending the in context training that can be done right in the context window, and kind of zero shot, one shot kind of idea, and the promise that holds. And it's in the trillions of parameters now, so it's more than 170 billion, right? But it's
Yeah, more than yes, yeah, absolutely. I think GPT-3 or GPT 3.5, I think 3 was trained on 170 billion. I'm sure the later ones are way bigger. Yeah.
yeah. Now Omni is or O GPT-4o.
Yeah.
The latency is dropped because you're not going off to different other models to do something. It's all trained within this single model that really improves the efficiency and the delay for a consumer. If a consumer interacts with the GPT-4o, you don't get that delay because it doesn't have to go elsewhere. It's all trained within that same model, and it you can point your uh, video camera on your phone to something, and it can actually take a look.
Yeah, multimodal is quite amazing. Yes.
Yeah, this idea of multimodal meaning different ways of understanding data. So whether it's vision or sound or text or et cetera, it's fully integrated in that way. How do you see that improving what you're doing?
Oh, the types first is that the data that we work with, right? It could be a really complex PowerPoint deck, for example, all those figures and diagrams and tables in the scientific data, right? And then that now you can actually analyze. That's the first thing. And second, right, it's basically it's all of a sudden it actually give you the 100% of the intelligence from your document rather than limited to text, which is like, probably 80%. For some of the data, is probably even less, right? Could be 50%. That's the first thing. So pulling out more intelligence out of the existing documents. And secondly, being able to work with new types of data, right? Videos and video and audio recordings and what have you. And if you see that the healthcare industry is moving towards this multimodal capability, allows us to actually incorporate sort of that types of data, right? The videos and audios into our evidence, if you will, right? Really give a new context into real world data. And if you look at healthcare side, look at patient population. I think I did see some survey that came out just a couple of weeks ago and saying, baby boomers that patients that are older, they tend to rely on chat. They like to use video. They like to use voice to interact with physicians. So even healthcare now are saying, personalization, use generative AI. Can we incorporate these non-traditional kind of modalities to be able to engage with patients, to communicate with patients? So we open up a whole new area. I'm quite excited about that capability.
Um, you know, uh, GPT-4o has not been released to the consumer, has not, except for select groups, right? Select groups are already played, just like they're using.
We're using it.
Oh, okay, so you're one of the fortunate group that's already actively using it, but the rollout to the consumer marketplace is not, it hasn't been fully released. What's your kind of raw impression of it, because you're using it? So it just sort of this visceral experience, right? Because it's at another level. Can you describe what that's like?
It's better. It's better than GPT-4, right? I mean, you brought up latency. That's actually a huge issue, right? It's like we actually had internal discussions. It's like some of the tech folks is like, so what? Like you get your answers in 5 minutes. So I'm the one that have to, and me and my co-founder will have to push. Speed is important. Think of our end users, right? They're just like consumers, right? The first time they're like, oh, 5 minutes is okay. And then the next time they're like, can I get faster? And then instantly, can you just like have the chat GPT experience, right? Turning it instantly. So I think there's a lot of like demand on speed. So latency to us is a huge issue. So being able to have a model to be able to kind of reduce latency is critical to us.
And then when you, like you said, it can understand visuals, including video. How much have you played with that in its ability to understand visuals and video?
We actually did a little bit of validation work for the models with for OpenAI before they were released. So we kind of understood. So they were like, can you I'm interested in this. Just test it for this for science for us, right? It's like so we have a little bit of experience. We knew it was great before it was released. So so we are using it. It's still at early stage, but we're embracing it wholeheartedly.
So I'm doing a bit of active brainstorming with you. So I do these daily AMAs and keynotes with CEOs. They're private and global investors and actually sovereign fund principles and things like that. And I've got one upcoming. I'm going to insert maybe a piece of this interview when it's released and then point to the full interview for the audience. Because I did invite it for one thing. Can you tell us about amazing innovation out there and point to people who are doing it? So I can easily do that with you because I think what you're doing is amazing. Do you have a demo that you can send me of you using Omni or something that I can insert into
Into Omni? Yeah, no, we don't use Omni as a whole. It's like we have a tool, and the GPT 4.0, it's only just a piece of it. We actually swap in and out of models like just 15 minutes. So we use different models. We actually use different models at different points of our pipeline. So are you requesting a demo of our product, or you're requesting a demo how we use a ChatGPT?
I actually both, because it depends on the keynote that I'm doing, right? So I do these all the time. For example, I just finished one in Philadelphia to about 600 CEOs. And I got one upcoming to, which I mean, I can't talk about it unless they go public with it, but a lot of these are private. The one with about approximately 600 CEOs, they actually did a public posting of the private talk. And in fact, I was there with David. I brought in David Rue, who's your...
Yep, of course, I know him.
Yeah, he's a great guy. So I recommended him. So we did kind of like a joint piece of the CEO event. But I think your work would be really interesting to the ones that are coming up. So actually both, if you can give me a demo of your entire platform, and I may have to cut it, right? Because I can't spend 10 minutes on what you're doing, but I'll definitely like to point to what you're doing. And then if you have even a segment of how you're using Omni, that'd be great too, because that's so current and people be very curious, right? So
I might have a side-by-side comparison. Let me talk to my CTO to see what we can provide. Maybe,
okay.
how soon do you need this?
My deck's due today, so or within a few days anyway, right?
Okay, yeah, let's see what we can.
Okay, that sounds great. I mean, I just love what you're doing. Who's a client, and then how is your client onboarded, and then how would your client actually use your platform, Huma AI?
So our clients are life sciences companies, could be global pharma, could be large pharma companies, outside the globals, top 20s, and also could be mid-size pharma, and also could be a medical device and diagnostic companies. So we work with all of those. And then onboarding is very much, we're a enterprise SaaS, and we have a licensing of the platform. And then, depends on like therapeutic areas, depend on sort of the data sources. There's a lot of flexibility into how clients engage with us. For folks who are still unsure of kind of generative AI and what have you, particularly working with your private data, then we could start with a pilot as well. So we work with public data like the scientific publications or clinical trials, or even pulling stuff from like public websites and what have you, to private data like medical affairs and commercial team. And so far, we don't work in the clinical side, just because there's a a vast market and there's lots of competition, and we just want to focus on what we do best.
Right. So you're really a SaaS play, right? Software as a service kind of platform that people can integrate into what they're doing in as you indicated, it could be medical device or pharma and things like that. I actually belong to a CEO alliance, and I'm on their executive working group for AI. And there's medical devices in their company, so I'll check internally to see if they're using you. If they're not, then I'll check to see if they're interested, and then I'll just do an introduction. I
That'd be
think,
great. Yeah. We
and then
work with Qiagen. We work with a couple of others, but Qiagen, because we publish peer reviewed paper, so it's in the public domain.
yeah, and then there's pharma companies too. So okay, so I'll be thinking about this. I mean, I understand what you're doing then, and in a much kind of overview sense, right? That's kind of fits this interview.
More importantly, right, is the value, right? Our clients typically don't care, okay, how do you use LLM, which LLM? They're just saying, can you solve my problem, right? I mean, we can shorten the process. It typically takes them days to weeks to get those evidence that we can shorten it to minutes, right? So they can focus on like more important work, right? We kind of free them up from tasks so they can focus on their job. That's what we would like to say.
Yeah, I mean, I can see you as you have in your profile, it automates data creation with high accuracy and transparency. Definitely will shorten the time from weeks to minutes. I mean, I get it. You're a technology thought leader. Your Gartner has named you as the leading generative AI vendor in over 20 hype cycle reports. So that's
Yeah,
great.
that was fun, right? That was great. Yeah.
And then you're part of the Pegasus program, and Microsoft has a really careful vetting program. So for you to be in that program, you're female founders 250, member of the Forbes Technology Council. Just a great background. I want to vector the remaining minutes, just talk about trends in general. So we talked about GPT-4o Omni. Um, there was a paper that came out earlier this year on using random knowledge graphs, right, and applying it to try to figure out, maybe get a little bit more insight on how these things are working. And I thought was really interesting about the paper was they said that it seems to be doing creating novel skill sets and then applying it in a novel way to, um, um, you know, producing results, which means they think there's something else going on. And then if you look at other papers, there's a scaling law that seems to follow, right? You put more data in, you go more multimodal, or it just gets more insight. You get emergent properties coming out or capabilities. Um, do you think that we'll have more of this AGI capability within a year? And let me take a subset of AGI. I'm talking about something that is different than humans, but can comparable to what we do, and maybe even better at some things than we are. Do you think that's going to be happening in a year's time, or do you think it's 2 to 3 years out, or do you think it's like 10 years out?
This is such a great topic, right? Where do I start? Well, I think AGI is near, but for the domain that we're in, it's not that close, right? It's because it's such an expert driven industry, right?
Right.
So that we see how human experts work with AI. It actually drives AI, right? Those questions we're asking, you should think about when you use ChatGPT, right? The better questions you ask, you refine your prompts and what have you, you get that better answer. That's a really kind of very simple illustration of how human can be in the loop, right? Can be center of AI,
Right.
right? So what scares me though is like we know the capability because we ask those questions, we test them, right? What is a capability that's beyond our imagination? We don't know, right? So, like you said, it's like they're discovering new skill sets. I have a suspicion this is already there, but then it's almost like yes, humans can be the driver of this, but also human limitations. And also I worry about I think this multimodal is really exciting.
Yeah.
The agents, right? Are really exciting. But then if if we can automate all the kind of complex tasks through agents, then what are we left with as humans, right? I think this is where, and the job replacement, like, taking away jobs is a huge issue, right? You heard this in the news about certain big tech layoffs because of AI. So I think it's a societal issue, right? It's here. It's here. It's inevitable. It's trying to put genie back into the bottle, right? So I think I'm a huge proponent for a universal basic income, for example. So we're kind of leveling the field so that allows people to do different things to actually, prepare us for this onslaught of AI changing our society. That's why I'm a big proponent for regulation, but I hope they can, like, the regulatory bodies can move a little faster.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating. If you look back a year or then 2 years ago, and every time I do a keynote in AMA, I actually embed demos. And I literally 2 years ago, if somebody said, could an AI create the song, write the music, the singer's voice, people said, no, that's like 10 years out. And literally in the last three keynotes, I've embedded, like Soda AI or Udeo and the demos. And my last one were to these 600 CEOs. They asked me, could you do a music video? So I actually generated artificially a photorealistic lady singing the song and whose lips matched the song, right? And I'm telling this, right? 2 years ago, people were just, it's not possible, right? So
now it's advancing so rapidly. I can imagine every time you prepare a demo, it's like things are different, right? There are more capabilities.
So dated.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I think particularly in healthcare, right? Patient privacy is such a big issue, right? You're talking about, data breach and what have you. I'm very kind of interested to see where this AI companion takes us, because then folks now are using ChatGPT as like their therapist, right? So there are like a lot of private information that's supposedly to be covered by HIPAA now, or it's actually got like released into the AI models. We'll see.
Yeah, and these AI models are going to have episodic and semantic memory capability planning, as you mentioned. Agents have been out there for over a year now, almost a couple of years, right? And that embodiment of the agents is becoming more just a natural part of how these models are going to be extended, right? And then the embodiment also into robots. There was this idea that that's a barrier, right? Because they're disembodied, and now there's embodiment into robots that have sensors, and that's maybe one of the critical barriers to its progression, and that's happening. So it's an interesting conversation. I just want to inject a couple of more ideas. Quantum computing, Microsoft has some called Microsoft Zero Quantum Elements. I think that's really amazing. So this whole area of quantum and being applied to healthcare, right? And supercomputing, which is exascale already, that you can do a billion operations per second. I believe that zettascale is not too far off. And then your semiconductors, the scaling that's occurring in semiconductors. Every time Jensen Huang does a keynote, seems like there's another breakthrough that he's mentioned here or something like that. So do you want to cherry pick any of those that you want to comment on? And because they all have application to healthcare, right? In fact, I did an interview with Philip Wong at Stanford, and he's the chief scientist at Taiwan Semiconductor, and he talked about embedding a chip into a cell. They could do it, and you could monitor and control the behavior of a cell with this chip wirelessly, right? And so, so anyways,
I mean, all these work actually proceeds a generative, right? Generative AI. So, supercomputing, I was in genomics. So, supercomputing was like, a big deal. I'm always a huge believer of quantum computing. I think it's the future, right? But I have a feeling like, this is the world according to Lana, is that generative AI is going to be the driver of a lot of this. Some of them, maybe like some of the supercomputing side might be deemed unnecessary as the capabilities of these foundation models become even more and more powerful. I mean, you look at like NVIDIA is a great example, right? I mean, they see that generative AI is driving so much of their chip demand. Of course, latency, speed, speed, speed.
Right.
So they're building, new generations of chips all the time, and also that kind of impact them. They have to come out with new chips at much faster cycle. So I think this is generative AI is going to be the driver of, particularly now we're moving into modal, we're moving into agentic. It's going to be the driver of everything.
I mean, I'm just thinking. There's this WWDC conference with Apple, and all sorts of announcements being made. But I think generally you can see now they've integrated AI. We call it Apple Intelligence. And
Yeah, they have a partnership with OpenAI. Yes.
yeah, and they're embedding it into everything, right? Which they that was kind of the final question mark. Well, that question mark is now answered, right? So um, this is now down to our last question, because you sit across all of this in some way. So you're sort of the ideal, perfect interview. Do you have any questions that you want to leave the audience, or some final recommendations, or both in the remaining couple of minutes?
Okay, there's a couple of things I want to address, right? Sometimes I feel like me and my cohorts like live in a little bubble or a big bubble, right? AI generative, like day in and day out. And then that survey that came out of Oxford, right? They surveyed like across 6 countries, and how many people have used ChatGPT once or regularly. It's a very, very, very small percentage of the population of the folks that they surveyed. So it's still a very small portion of the world that actually exposed to this new AI innovation. So I think education is really important, right? There's a lot of buzz in the media, good or bad. So I think education on the general public about the what generative AI is, how it's going to impact the industry, is going to ease a lot of the fear. That's the first thing. And of course, misinformation. That's a huge thing, right? Misinformation existed before generative, and it's just going to be on steroids. So how do we, as a society, regulate and mitigate that, right? The risk. I think they're all coming kind of on a general kind of public side. I think from your audience, right? I encourage everyone to think about use cases, right? It's almost like it's so big, it could apply to everything. How do we get started? We see these kind of conundrums in our dilemma, in our clients, in our folks that we work with, right? So my recommendation is start small, right? Think about your current process, your current workflow, your current challenges. Which one is mission critical and yet labor intensive, time consuming, and also it's measurable, right? Those are the ones you should start with. Start with the low hanging fruit.
That's a really great advice to the audience, and definitely actionable. So, Lana, thank you for coming in. You just have a marvelous background. You gave some great insights to my audience. I really appreciate you taking the time and for the hour and talking with me. So,
thank you so much, Stephen. I had a great time too. Great questions.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.